Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm here with a panel from Heatwave magazine, which is a magazine that has some ties to the historic ultra left, a term I don't even like. The name definitely is reminiscent of either an old situationist magazine or a music magazine we're not going to talk about. So I wanted to bring you on because I've liked a lot of your articles in the world of communist publishing right now. We've seen sort of a decline in publications tied to more what Jacobin and co would disparage as ultra left tendencies within the ultra left, or within the left in general, and a rise of both social democratic and soft Marxist-Leninist publications such as Monthly Review, Jacobin Magazine, and then a lot of people formerly associated with tendencies like communization, writing for New Left Review of Books or New Left Review, and the LA Review of Books. So it's an interesting time in that world, and you guys seem to be trying to make a kind of intervention specifically in light of where we are historically in capitalism and in terms of climate change. But you've also done some interesting work on like the tariff issue and what might actually be going on there, because clearly it can't be what the current administration says it is, or if it is what the current administration says it is. The reason why it's being supported by members of the capitalist class can't be the same reason. So I wanted to have you on to talk about that. Would you like to introduce your project and what you do for that project? We can start with Bruno.
Yeah, so I'll just introduce my role in the project, which is mostly on the design end of the spectrum. Designing some of the zines and designing the magazine itself. Also do some Spanish translation when it arises, and trying to connect people, like connecting with the Latin American section of the tariff people, well, the Mexican section specifically. But yeah, and then next person go on, and then we'll describe the magazine later in a bit.
All right. We'll go on, Common Ruin.
Okay, yeah. Hi. So I wrote the article that's in issue 1 under the pen name Common Ruin, and I'm trying to bring some like ecological perspectives and see, I guess, what happens when I bring some like recent ecological and biological theory into dialogue with some more Marxist and materialist thinking. I guess I'm interested in how moving past the sort of degrowth conversation, the back and forth about growth versus degrowth. And I feel like, well, there's like some value in that, especially thinking about like total material flows. There's a lot more to talk about with ecology and communism. So besides writing, I do a lot of editing, and I've done some of the design stuff too, like the logos and stuff.
Yeah, my role has primarily been editing at this point, and doing a little bit of the like back end finance stuff. I hate to call it finance stuff because we don't really have the finances to do the finance stuff yet, but you know, the moving of the coins, so to speak. Yeah, I think I will probably write stuff at some point, or it'll be jointly written. But that's sort of been my role in the project so far.
And what are the overall goals of the project? As I mentioned, left communist publishing has not been on the up and up, but left publishing has, even though it hasn't really corresponded with the growth in the left overall. So wanted to know why this project and why now?
I guess I'll say,
Yeah,
for
take it
me,
away.
it was important to get something in print. There's a lot of interesting writing you can find online. There's not a lot, as you said, besides Jacobin, um, other than more academic journals. There's not a lot of print media with these kinds of perspectives. So, I mean, obviously the website reaches a lot of people and it helps make the project more international. But yeah, doing print was like a priority for me. And then as far as the magazine itself, I guess we've kind of chosen, at least with our first couple editorials, to sort of emphasize an ecumenical perspective. Like, we don't say we're an ultra left or left communist magazine. There's certainly affinities that some of us have with particular tendencies, but I think we don't want to limit ourselves or pigeonhole ourselves exactly in that way. Yeah, I guess I'll let somebody else talk about the overall.
I mean, one thing I'll add to that is like, and this maybe sounds a little silly, but like sometimes you just have to do something with people that you like, and doing things. There's often a lot of activity that happens outside of the doing things. So whether you're like at a demo, or you're doing the dishes, or you're writing a magazine, or you're going on a hike, or whatever it is, like there's sometimes a central activity around which other kinds of social life can take place. And I think that part of like, for me, that's one way that I think about the print magazine, is that it really is this, it is kind of like the central thing through which another broader media ecosystem can grow, but it's also just activity that we can do together and as a way to connect with other people, even outside of what we write and what comes out of that project. So there is something about that that's important to me, where like the magazine is the thing that kind of helps us get together about lots of other things too beyond the magazine. And I think maybe this is a discussion that we can have a little bit later, but we're trying to find ways to do a print magazine that's actually doing somewhat short form content. Like, I think a lot of the way that the sort of, whether it's in the left or just in the media publishing in general, has been like a lot of the short form stuff will go out online, and then you have these longer form outlets for print content. And I think there's a reflex to say that the longer the format, the more whatever physical or something. And we're trying to do something where we have these shorter form pieces that are in fact coming out in print. And then through that, you can get connected to other forms of digital content, whether that's through the Patreon or on our Discord channel or things like that. So I think we're trying to find something in there that works both, that kind of gets out of the escape of being potentially over academic, but also something that's physical as well.
Bruno, did you want to say anything else on that?
Sure. I was gonna see if Derick wanted to say something, but yeah, no, I think just it was very important to have just like a presence of like a left wing that isn't necessarily that has like an anti-state bend towards it, and that has like a physical presence in people's minds, or I guess out in the world. Because for too many, I guess it feels like the ultra left, or like this more committed people, in my opinion, to like a liberatory project, are like, it's very online here in the States or in this side of the world. And to have something physical to be able to like connect and tell people about and point to it, like, hey, you can get this at this bookstore or whatever, and then get connected to like a wider network of people, like Chris was saying, was just really important. And I don't know, just there was like, it's kind of like the network of like anarchists sharing zines around, but also with a more as much as anarchists are cool and stuff, a more rigorous accounting and analysis of various longer term trends that I feel that various strands of the ultra left or of communist theorization has, that just like often I find wanting in anarchist spaces. Yeah, and that's, I guess, why I like wanted to join the project, to kind of like push for that type of weird mix and also to make the magazine look pretty.
Fair enough. I do want to ask you guys about this because I have noticed two trends amongst the general left in the past decade since I started getting involved in this. I mean, I've been involved in this for like almost 20 years, but after Occupy, there was a flourishing of what we could call it left communist and anarchist publishing, but then the anarchist stuff quickly died back. And the anarchist milieu, if we are completely honest, its heyday was really before Occupy. It's kind of a 90s through aughts after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I call it a milieu advisedly because I believe, for example, that the anarchist movements of that time period don't have a lot of historical connection to prior anarchist movements. They seem to be kind of imminent critiques of the new left from the 70s, are imminent critiques of the movementism of the left in the 80s and 90s, or whatever the hell David Graeber was doing. But it does seem like now, outside of maybe some things around communization, which is why I think your magazine is often recognized as a ultra left magazine, even if it's not, or even if you don't conceive it solely that way, is because the vision of a stateless society, even in the long term, is increasingly not something that's in the left vocabulary. Modern monetary theory is dominated by national technocratic orientation. A lot of them are my fans, and they won't like that I say that, but it's kind of factually true. Jacobin, I don't know if most of the analytic Marxists believe a stateless society is possible. It's pretty clear that most of Marxist-Leninists are do not just believe it's not possible in the short term. They also have picked up threads by Dominica Lacerdo and et al. Who argue it's just something that should have been dropped in the early 20th century altogether. And I have chided them because I've told them even Stalin believed that eventually you'd have a stateless society. At least that's what he said. So do you find yourself, in a, not just because you're working with anarchists clearly, but also like trying to represent an anti-state or state skeptical position within the left that isn't so dependent on state-led social engineering themes, but also isn't tending towards weird, tailing the right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing our project has in common with yours is that we don't want to put out easy answers, and like a lot of the tendencies you just mentioned. I mean, how to put it? So that wave of like communization that you're thinking of post-Occupy is like typically cast as valorizing the riot, and then with the turn away from that and a lot of the criticism of that, it's just often a turn just towards a different easy answer, right? That we're gonna, against like all of the tendencies pushing it the opposite direction, we're gonna have this like red wave of revitalizing labor, or all the problems with electoralism people tend to ignore when there's like what seems like a temporary gain, like with Mandami. So I guess with Heatwave, we are kind of going against the tide in a lot of these ways. I feel like it's not even so much an ultra left position as just a more Marx centric position on a lot of these questions. Somebody else, if you want to add to that.
Bruno, you want to go? I'm still thinking of some stuff.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say my own. I mean, as much as I tried being like, oh, linking it to like my own identity or whatever, but I do think the anti-state position, or at least the anti-statism that brings up about, for me personally, it kind of comes from this lifetime of basically being structurally in opposition to the state, or at least the state necessarily like would. I grew up being afraid that my parents are going to get disappeared or deported back to Mexico, and it's this oppositional state that I think, or this oppositional, I don't know, just upbringing that kind of like informs my own like understanding of like, well, there are people that we're gonna be against the state, whether you're Marxist Leninist or whatever, whether this political project that we're in is generally going to be against this current state of affairs, whether we want to grab the state machinery for our own ends, or just as a general just abolish it all. But that question and the way it relates onto people who live already, I'm not going to say outside the state, because they're obviously still very much affected by the way the state does things and the way we go about our lives. But the way we are able to resist and continue on with our lives and reproduce our lives in general are very much like without these states, without necessarily relying with the assumption that the state is going to be there to help us in general, which is where for me, has always been the rub with like the Mamdani types, the like liberal types, because I mean, my family can't really like apply for various subsidies, especially coming from a deep red state where they're like very much willing, like if you fuck up on a bureaucratic form, there is a high chance that you're just gonna, ICE is gonna get called. And I'd say that, and for me at least, this ultra left, this anarchist influence, this anti-state left or communism or however you want to describe it, ecumenically, has been the most amenable to like how I lived my life, or like my family has lived our lives, and this deep commitment to an internationalism, to like a world without borders, to this anti-nationalism that I agree with. That I agree with you that this anti-nationalist world, or this anti-nationalist vision, or world without the state, is becoming increasingly harder to like imagine, to even like discourse within, like even abroad. I mean, but at least that's for me. That's like why I kind of like think having this physical magazine and this like space where this is like, these principles are important to us as writers and as like just people in the world, to be able to fight each other and to like keep that flame going on. Because I mean, I don't know, I've been able to have, because of this commitment to these principles, I've been able to have really awesome interactions and discussions and moments of resistance, and everything that makes life actually worth living. That's not fucking working construction that makes you want to commit suicide. And I don't know. I mean, I know it's not more that doesn't help the analytical people or whatever, but I mean, this is kind of like a more personal understanding of why I think this is just like talk about resistance against the state and maybe an anti-state vision, if people are amenable to that, is important to have. And not to be too moralistic about it either. So.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I would just add too that putting something out there that can challenge maybe some of the sort of taken for granted assumptions that might come out of a left sort of sphere, that I think in a certain sense is relatively more revitalized than it had been, maybe 20 years ago or something. Like, I think that there are the rise of certain parties, certainly in the United States. There's like the Trump era that has given people some inklings of reflection outside of the Democratic Party. And I think that the degree to which there are a variety of perspectives that could, maybe reach those folks and sort of poke at some of the assumptions that they might hold around what's possible or how to do politics or what that looks like. I think that can be sort of particularly valuable to exist. And I think it's an open question about whether we're reaching those people, and whether like there's what does it take to reach folks like that might have had experiences at demos or had experiences living through adverse political effects of all the horrible shit that's going on, and being like, man, how do I make sense of what just happened because my world got rocked? And those people are going to go to the interpretations that are available to them, and we want ours to be available to them as well, and that can be sort of, you know, brought into the fold as logically and as reasonably as you know, oh, I'm gonna like, this is why I should canvass for a politician, or this is why I should try and you know, push for some certain legislation that might actually be very materially helpful, but might also sort of signal the end of the road of a political imagination.
Well, political imagination is an interesting point, because my critique of the left post 2014 and 2015 is, and even that critique of the left, I actually should be careful with that, because most of the people who do that end up being kind of full of shit, because we don't know what left means for them. It's a floating signifier. But my critique of the various tendencies that emerged after Occupy is that at a time period where the power of nation states seemed more limited because hegemons were beginning to hit power limits, we also started seeing doubling down on almost all sides. And I don't just mean all sides of the left. I mean all sides of society, all sides of political discourse, on national discourses. And at the same time, the problems that we face are not national. Be they, you know, one of the things that's implied in your name, that we're dealing with climate change. That's not a national problem. There's not a single nation that can address it by itself. And, you know, all power to the Chinese in their ecological society pushes. I'm not saying that's bad, and I have a trust but verify attitude towards it. But frankly, that's not enough. You still have to deal with India. You still have to deal with the developed world, which still uses a disproportionate amount of resources. And in all the cases, not only have they not, these national and international agreement frameworks not delivered, they've also been turned on in their internal polities. And unfortunately for a lot of people in the United States, the United States has become weirdly both more global in its influence because of the domination of English on the internet, but also more parochial in its understanding of itself. So, for example, people who think that the democratic malaise is a problem voluntaristically of bad Democrats and not something we're seeing about liberal elites across most of the planet, or the completely either damning or, in a lot of cases on our end of the things, naively trusting statements about China as the future hegemon and how this is going to be good for everybody, because China is working economic miracles, even though their GDP has now normalized to regular capitalist GDP, and they seem to have gotten some wins from the Trump tariff, but they're hoarding gold because they seem to be afraid that the international economic order is going to be in some severe trouble, and they're not yet at a place to lead it, in quotation marks. And I don't see that discussed right now, frankly. I mean, what you normally see is either people doing apologetics for the Chinese state, or people condemning it, or you know, in the pages of like Jacobin, they just don't deal with it at all. Similarly, when talking about Mexico, a place that I know really well because I lived there for a while, and am deeply invested in, there's a lot of left celebration of Steinbaum as if like she's Lenin or something. It's bizarre. And not a lot of dealing with the actual economic policies that are going on, just because they're, you know, they are better than what the or the PON was doing, right? But that's a really low bar. But, you know,
Yeah.
you know, not disappearing a bunch of college activists and teachers is, you know, kind of a minimum strategy for liberal society. It's not even like a left-wing project. Anyway, and you guys actually are one of the few outlets reporting on some of the more contradictory elements on the international sphere, not just the national one. I think about stuff in your tariff dossier that actually tried to deal with this tariff development from an international perspective, not just from the national perspective that one sees on like TikTok and Twitter right now.
Right.
So, what do you think is missing in a lot of the discourse around where we are in the world around this, and like what these tariffs mean, or what BRICS means, or any of that? It's a big question, admittedly.
Common Rune, you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I mean, so on the tariff question, I'm not like an expert on this, but that's part of why I'm really glad we were able to solicit some really great contributions, especially like because we're talking about China. Like, it's really great that Shuang contributed their piece, and Shuang is a project that is like an inspiration for us as a collective, and yeah, and I think we'll hopefully see more contribution from them soon. But like you bring up, I mean, China, regardless of the degree to which it could be classified as socialism, is still subject to the same forces as any other capitalist economy. And when it comes to the energy transition, like, that's often a misnomer, because what you see is more renewable production, and at the same time either a maintenance or an expansion of fossil energy use, and an overall increase in total energy throughput. So yeah, I don't know why there is this tendency for these kinds of topics to be ignored on the left. It's certainly irritating and irresponsible.
I have my theories, but they're almost conspiratorial, aka funding. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking goes to just how, again, to like a lack of political imagination of just like how different things can be. I mean, so much of the world, and I think to kind of like go a bit on your point of even domestic workers despise when liberal elites try to kind of like address climate change by doing popular policies. I mean, this is kind of like around the world of work, and a complete lack of imagination of like, well, everybody uses all this just for like gas, protests against the rising gas prices or gas taxes or fossil fuel taxes that kind of like there's been a thread of them over the years. And just how much gas is involved in petrol, I guess, in to use the UK parlance, is used just to go around places, or to use to undergird the economy and our daily lives, and just how much people don't want for our daily life to change in that fundamental way. Or even in many places outside the developed world, a desire to have that quality of life that developed places have, that is undergirded by a fossil fuel economy, or even just by a level of consumption and consumerism and really shitty American culture that that is ever present and just like desired by, especially by rising middle class in a lot of developing countries, where they learn English. I mean, in Mexico, there's like certain type of person that is kind of like sprinkles English in various conversations, just to like kind of show them, kind of just to make themselves feel a bit better than the lower class people. So I think that's kind of like why there's kind of like this lack of interrogation, or like really concrete interrogation with like just environmentalism in general and climate change more specifically. I mean, I don't know. I come from like a very rural background, and I mean, even I don't know. I come back from my parents' hometown, and they, I come back smelling like petrol a lot of times, because there's just so much use of that around town. Because it's just necessary to live daily life there. I don't know. Yeah, that's what I have to say on that specific question. And then Chris, you can say your piece.
Yeah. I think maybe my reflection is a little bit different, but one of the things, at least at the international scale, that I'm interested in Heatwave thinking through and writing about, and I think we do this to a certain extent at on the tariffs dossier, is like, I think with Trump and with the rise of sort of politicians, like on the one hand, people feel like Trump does stuff, and sometimes people feel like other politicians don't do stuff, and what that leads them to think is like, oh, politics in its formal sense is a space where people can do things as long as you have people to do them. And so you just need people to do the right things, and then you get this certain like political change, even if we don't like it and even if we're scared of it. I think it gives people this capacity to think that if you just have the right leaders that are like really ready to just get their hands dirty, that the political machine can actually like function, and maybe not well, but it can do things. And I think that people's reflection of politics for a long time was like, oh, like nothing can be done. Like we're just sort of in this, and this is, to borrow from Endnotes, which is also a journal I think a lot of us are influenced by, is like, that they lay out in their holding pattern essay, I think really well, that there are these like real material constraints to the way that the sort of the international community can come to face with some of the core contradictions of capital, and that there are certain things, there's a space for maneuver in which different leaders or different parties can push for one thing or the other, but to really get a broader view of where that room ends and where there isn't actually a lot of space to maneuver unless you take serious consequences from, you basically set up these really extreme winner and loser situations. And so I think, on the one hand, it's a tricky thing to develop in a magazine or in any political analysis, where on the one hand you need to stress and underline that human beings can really change their social relations and their material conditions because they are social relations, but at the same time that it can only be done through a breaking to a certain extent of the conditions in which you're in right now, and going all the way through the formal machine to the sort of like great man theory of political change will only get you so far. And I think that a good international materialist analysis of the economy can help sort of chart out that path through, the sort of the inability of people to change their current conditions within the constructs of those current conditions, and the need to kind of go beyond that.
To quote Marx in the 18th Brumaire, men make their own history, but not under their own doing, or not under their own desired conditions. Well, whatever the quote is.
Yeah, no, you're actually pretty close. I also quote that all the time and slightly wrong.
Just call it a remix. Call it,
conditions of their own choosing.
Yeah. That was it.
I mean, to only get it properly, we have to actually quote it in 19th century German, but like whatever.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to pop in on that question just a little bit more, because I feel like we can look at the Trump administration, and this ties into, you read Jamie Merchant's article. They're trying to respond to these conditions of like overproduction, declining productivity, with or profitability, I should say, with this like bombastic, like no holds barred, extreme like approach. Like we're going to accept that it's a zero-sum game, and we're going to, besides the tariffs, like they're going to abolish the roadless rules and just try to like bring it mining and logging into every stretch of wilderness. And it's not even working. Like the job statistics are tanking.
No. Yeah. So, all the statistics that they're interested in, not just the job statistics. Even like trade imbalance has gotten worse. Like everything they've done has accelerated the things that they're supposed. Well, I really don't know if they actually care about them or not. I suspect it's a mixture of sincerity in some cases, and like I do think they really would like to reindustrialize, but also since they're now an allegiance with tech overlords, they'd like to do it mostly with robots. So I'm like, okay, so how that, like, since you're also getting the social safety net, how does that work without, 10, 15 years down the line, you're basically at civil war? Maybe they're just trying to bring that preemptively. I don't know.
Yeah. But so with all that, if this sort of extreme MAGA approach isn't working, then to me, it's even more cause for people to question the idea that social democracy in these conditions is still viable, that like we can have something just like now except more fair. I mean, and I get why that's a popular position on the left, because it's really easy to, you know, you're raised like a liberal or whatever, and it's really easy to move into like a social democratic position where you get this idea of like, it's like, I think like Bruno was saying earlier, like our lives are basically going to stay the same, but things will just be more fair somehow. And again, like bringing it back to Marx, you know, we go to, this isn't like esoteric notes from the Grundrisse, it's Capital Volume 1, that the capital establishes forms appropriate to it. And that's talking about production, but those forms are carved into the landscape. And this isn't a sort of like material world that can just be run in a more fair way. Sorry.
No. You don't apologize for that. That's actually a great point. I mean, like I've been thinking a whole lot about how social democracy, as it is often presented, or democratic socialism, since the democratic socialists don't want to admit they're Keynesians, and social democrats have mostly long since done that in the 50s. Did it have some serious problems? One is that there's been a large scale denial, and not just from all kinds of sources, third world too, in the declining rates of profits. And now that people see that, you know, okay, even when we're not dealing with commodity money or metal money, even when we are not, even when everything's turning into rents, there is a profitability crisis on physical commodities. That's like mainstream economists don't even really deny that now. Yet for the last 2 decades, a lot of the left, even the Marxist left, has been hardcore denying that's a problem. And I do think it has to do with this commitment to a fairer social democracy, because if you believe in any or the organic capital problems, you can't run a capitalist society and be fair. It would collapse. It would not have surplus to spread around. So or at very minimum, even if you had not like nominal in the sense of like you had currency moving around because you have some kind of modern monetary conditions, there would be a slowdown of production that would cause a serious problem, even if it is decoupled from any sort of monetary apparatus. And I don't see, or let me put it to you another way. The problems that Trumpism has, as you guys have been implying, actually are also problems for social democracy and Sandersism and Corbynism and all of that. And it's not dealt with. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think this kind of goes into something I wanted to get into since you mentioned Scheinbaum. And in the tariff dossier, we had comrades at Editorial Conatus talk about, they did an accounting of like the problems that Mexico is facing and the problems that Scheinbaum either inherited or is kind of like actively working against or contributing to, rather. And that kind of is, I mean, so many people on the electoral left kind of like see Scheinbaum as like just a success story of the left, of like reindustrialization, or I should say the project of Morena, rather broadly, AMLO and Scheinbaum. But I mean, but it is like to deny its popularity is kind of deny reality, because he really is a popular president. I mean, I just saw today that apparently she had like 70+% approval ratings in the opposition party or opposition parties. But I mean, the Social Democratic Project still relies on a bunch of narco violence that hasn't been addressed. I mean, there's currently repression against the Zapatistas in Chiapas, like various incursions into their territories, which is scarcely mentioned, at least on the left, and at least in the places that I'm looking at, which, to be fair, is not necessarily traditional leftist media. Rampant environmental destruction, especially in the north, and especially in conjunction with with narco agribusiness, not to mention the capture of agricultural businesses by narco capitalism. It's kind of like this, and I don't know. I don't remember. I don't believe the Gonatu described it this way, but I kind of been thinking about the like position that Mexico is in terms of like the economic social stratification, especially as someone who's coming from northern Mexico, and unfortunately, not going to go further than that, but it is kind of like a capitalist dual power state right now in some places where you have, you can get either fucked over by the government or you can get fucked over by the narcos, and and both of them you're not gonna, you don't really have recourse for much of them, but at least with the government, they're giving you some money to survive and you get a sense of national pride against Donald Trump. But I mean, that really isn't, not much consolation. And we're kind of seeing that also with Carney right now in the support for the, I forget what the Liberal Party is called there. The Labor Party? That's not the Labor Party.
No, it's the Liberal Party. It is just the Liberal Party.
Okay.
It's just the Liberal Party.
Liberal Party. Yeah. But Carney getting a lot of support because of Trump's comments as Canada being the 51st state. But, that's kind of, again, that's like the language and discourse of nationalism. I mean, at least Mexico has the capacity, industrial capacity right now to back up and fund that social democratic project. But like what happened in the 50s in Mexico, what happens when the money runs out or when global, economic growth slows down, like we're all saying is going to happen, or, like you were mentioning that we're kind of like ignoring that problem. Or we aren't, or at least we're trying not to. But most leftists are ignoring and not kind of seeing what's written on the wall.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go through the variety of answers that I normally hear. One is usually some MMT-based answer that we can inject enough liquidity to keep things going long enough to get production back up and get consumption back up to eat that. But the problem with that is obvious if you think about the climate crisis. Since we are not really focusing on new kinds of production, nor is all green production actually all that green in its first instantiation. And if you have to keep doing it, that kind of defeats the purpose.
Right. And as you pointed out, also the tendency for production to expel more and more workers from the workforce as it increases automation. So
yeah. I mean, Phil Neal's work on this is
pretty shitty in my opinion. So it's not even the type of life I want to live under.
Right. I mean, and then you have this idea of like the entire world can't run a services economy, nor can we. I remember reading McKinsey work, and she was talking about these digital economies as if are in the techno neo-feudal people. Most of them talk about like Facebook and stuff as if just the media end of that is floating the entire economy up. And I'm like, okay, just to explain stocks to you people, the Magnificent Seven is the only thing holding most of the stock market up right now. And most of that, from what I've now looked at, is in the physical capacity of these power eating generation things, which are actually still a net money loser if you look at what's happening on the back end. And you also see it in the chip production, but there's a hard wall of that too. And so it's just like, okay, so the profitable things are still the things that are material. They're not these rent seeking things. And also, I don't know how your digital serfs get food or make food except from the global south. So that, again, it seems to be blocking out a whole lot of what's going on. And I say this also, I lived in northern Mexico for 2 years, and I lived at the end of the Zeta Sinaloa Cartel War when the PAN was also in charge of the local government, and the PRI had just come back to power in the national government. So to give you the time period I was there, it's also during the Oaxaca teachers strikes and whatnot.
I remember
Also-
my cousin. Yeah,
Mhm.
I was in Mexico there, and I remember my cousin being surprised that I was pro the teachers. He was shocked. I was like,
that was also a time when there was kind of an undeclared civil war in Michoacan between the autodefensas, the indigenous autodefensas, the federales, and the narcos in a three-way battle that Americans
Right.
kind of noticed because avocados got expensive.
Right.
But it was so I'm familiar with the fact that it's almost like a dual power state with the less violent narcos, which is not to say they're not violent, but they're they don't go in and do what the Zetas did and just behead half of a village. Becoming a kind of quasi government. I mean, when I lived there, they made sure that indirectly they made sure that I knew that they knew I was there and that they knew I was an American.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like,
Oh, yeah.
and
I mean...
and basically I had the privilege of being too white to disappear and too poor to be a kidnapping target.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mentioned Mexico just to say, like, even in the best, like, even in the success stories of social democracy that we have right now, it's still, like, there's still these problems that we're trying to address that are fundamental issues that are like, the problem of Trumpism is also the problem of Scheinbaum, is also the problem of China, is also the problem, it seems like there's something connecting all of this, and this is why, we're interested in the political economic question here. I mean, we're interested in other questions as well, of course, the environmental question as it relates to political economy. But, the way people want to just kind of like just put this in a box as being like a Trumpism problem, it's just, setting us for disaster, setting us to fail if there is like whenever we do finally have like a real movement to push Trump out, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I'm not even sure if that's the goal, but let's.
I mean, this does lead me to a question of the Biden administration and like elite response to that, and what you guys are doing is so outside of that I really appreciate it. But I also listen to all the major discourses that everyone else is served up right now.
We live in the States, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, I do read Mexican news because I do have a good enough grasp of Spanish to do that, but I also know how much I can trust that. But anyway.
Oh yeah. You don't have to tell me. I mean, I'm sorry, Common Ruin and Chris. Like, I feel this is becoming like a let's complain about Mexico.
I actually really love Mexico.
This is good.
It's my favorite country. But I do think that like if we look at this on an international spectrum, or even if you look at nationally, there's some key questions that people just don't ask very deeply. For example, why did the Biden administration just normalize so much of Trump policies? Was it just because the Democrats just really want the same thing that Republicans do, or is it that economic elites have a set of agenda concerns and they don't have answers to them, and those answers, the best answers they can form are somewhat consistent between administrations. And then it leads to weirder things like liberals arguing that the deportation regimes of Obama and Biden were better just because they looked outwardly more humane. And I am sort of like, well, are you mad about the theater? I mean, because it seems like you're mad that actually that the Obama and Biden governments were just more competent about doing this thing, not that this thing was happening.
I mean, self-admittedly, they want to go to brunch.
Right, yes. As I have famously written. But yeah, I mean, it does. It does kind of lead us into this weird question: is why is that the case, or why is it? Maybe to make a sharper point that isn't just U.S. centric. Why is it that the liberal parties everywhere, including Canada, are having stagnations and a lack of ability to respond to their own base? That is not just a problem of the Democratic Party in the United States. It is more acute in Europe and the UK than it is here, even. I mean, you just look at Keir Starmer's numbers are pretty much any I mean, like the SPD in Germany, how fast did they flame out? Like it was incredibly quickly. And there are exceptions to that. Lula's Brazil. But even there,
even Brazil,
it's weaker than you think. Like the popularity that Lula has is not transferred to his party.
Mhm.
So,
I mean, I gotta think a lot of this is connected to COVID. Like, I think there was really something about the return to some kind of what a lot of liberals felt was a more established and certain way of managing the world. And I think the other thing that happened, I think, at that time was the variability of COVID responses among seemingly or liberal in name parties, because you got a variety of different approaches to something that was a global crisis, and I think when people see that play out on the sort of the political scale, they say there are different ways to do things. There is difference. There is possibility. There is choice. And actually, they don't see the degree to which those liberal parties, like you're pointing to, are unable to actually manage some of the fundamentals under that. But when you get something like a global pandemic that was managed quite differently, even if you can argue for certain like underlying material currents that impeded certain types of actions that could have taken place. Like it's not to say that anything was possible, but I think there's a sufficient variety for most people's engagement with politics, so it looks like a difference. And I think that is sufficient enough for people to believe that the football's not going to get pulled out from under them this time when they try and go kick it.
but it was though.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
I don't know. I go back and forth on this. Like, are they just afraid to rock the boat? And I mean, it's just like that was a French saying, après moi la déluge, like after me the flood. It's kind of like when you have these sort of octogenarian senators putting their investments first. It's kind of like, well, if I can just, get by and make a little more money before everything falls apart. Sometimes I think that is really like all that's going on. There isn't really much more thought to it. Like I saw a tweet the other day. Larry Summers is teaching at Harvard, and he's apparently assigning like Noah Smith's Substacks as like course material. So it's like, are they really just out of ideas? Are they giving up? I don't know. I mean,
I don't know. All I know is I'm putting Harvard education on my CV now.
Hell yeah.
Well, I will say this. One thing that I talk about that I do wish would come up more, and maybe is part of the reason why people don't recognize what's going on in China versus what's going on in the United States, because the Chinese elites are still relatively competent. And my theories around that have to do with like energy inputs and decadence cycles and stuff, like stuff that's actually largely impersonal, are not even about like, oh, like Chinese have a long view of culture and Americans don't. I'm like, well, but the Americans did in 1940. I don't know what you're talking about, really. I think when I look at this, I just think, oh, our capitalists are subject to some forces, some of which I think are older than capitalism, quite frankly, about where they are in a cycle of over specialization and decline. Then that is paired with these Marxist forces that we see in capital, and that is paired with global ecological crisis. And no one's going to really be up for that game by themselves. There's not an elite that can handle that. That's going to have to take everybody, all hands on deck, to kind of even figure out how to solve. And I guess it does bring me to another thing I liked about your journal. A lot of people misunderstand my critiques of growth and degrowth communism. Like, I find the whole debate somewhat tedious. Because when I go to look at what Kohei Saito or Lee Phillips, Saito, who I was initially very sympathetic towards, Lee Phillips, who I know and have had many conversations with, I find a total lack of political imagination about the future. I find some of the degrowthers to be a little bit more imaginative, but then some of their imagination, I think, is actually more Malthusian and worse. But also, when I talk about like what we need to deal with the different world, I am not talking about just growing GDP, because I just frankly don't think GDP would matter in even a socialist, much less a communist society. So
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of why I chose to write that article about beavers, to talk about how it's possible to exert a lot of energy and change the landscape on even a continental scale, but the way it's done matters, and that's why part of the degrowth conversation gets tedious, is because they're talking about like total energy use by a society in this like very abstracted way, not connecting it to like what is actually happening on the land. And so yeah. I hope to try to move conversations like green communization or whatever, as like Jasper called it, in a different direction. And in issue 2, actually, there's a really great article that a comrade wrote, that takes up the concept of non-domination, like from the Republican side of the Marxist tradition, and starts thinking about non-domination, and where that concept ends. Does it end with human beings, or does it apply to like ecosystems and so that's a piece that I think people will really like.
Yeah, I did like it. That's kind of what it got me thinking about the question, because I was reading, I was like, oh, finally, you guys don't make me pick a side between a debate where I think both sides actually should probably not exist, because it's a misunderstanding of the problem. The tariffs issues is interesting. You mentioned the Swang piece and the problems of labor in China and labor conditions in China, which I think people look at how much better things seem on paper than China, and then miss that like Chinese worker antagonism against both factories in the state is on an increase in a way we haven't seen in a while in Xi's China. And Xi's China, for the most part, a lot of the problems of the Hu Jintao era were kind of taken care of by finally doing some reinvestment in rural areas, and by encouraging a high reinvestment scheme. But it does seem like increased exploitation, and even things like trying to form large amounts of free youth labor so that the youth aren't just sitting around doing nothing, but since there's no private industry to pay them and they don't want to start giving stipends out because it will weaken the proletariat's something or other. I forgot what Xi argued. That it does seem like they're going to have a trouble, creating enough internal demand, and that the economies they wish to cooperate with are also export economies, not import economies. So it does seem like there's a real problem in the Chinese growth strategy in the long run, that has kind of been temporarily semi-stalled. I wouldn't say solved, but stalled by Europe wanting to pull off a little bit from the United States after Trump. But that, given Europe's own demographic crisis and everything else, that won't be a long-term solution to the problem. And the other thing I've really thought about is the restructuring of IMF loans that's going to have to come in a lot of the developing world, and it particularly in light of the frankly stalling and failure because of the Russia-Ukraine war of the Silk Road project, which was kind of, as I like to tell people, what that really was a Marshall Plan for the non-European world. But Marshall Plans are not as benign as you think they are. They're about building up economic resources and establishing trade controls in a regional hegemony. And that didn't happen.
I mean, China can't be imperialist; they're socialist.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've always said that this is partly because China is a responsible capitalist state versus a bunch of irresponsible capitalist states, and we've just lowered the bar so extremely low that looks like socialism to us.
Right.
But
I think the competency gap you talk about in our elites is real. But like, yeah, I mean, one of the latest Schwang pieces talked about youth unemployment hitting almost 19% this summer.
Yep.
So there's clearly cracks in the edifice. And again, this is why we're not putting out easy answers. Whereas like the Lacerdo fan club, I guess, is like basically pushing for a nationalist and dangist idea of what it means to be on the left, and not going there.
Well, it leads to a kind of paradox. I mean, in Lacerdoism in particular, because you can read Lacerdo and become a national chauvinist, and you can read Lacerdo and become a third worldist. Because essentially both the answers are nationalist, and you can have your class collaboration either way.
It's right. I mean, talk about choices that I don't want to be in either one.
Yeah. I mean, I just find that absurd to be arguing that we need to do developmental programs with a national bourgeoisie in the most developed part of capitalism. That just to me is like a laughable prospect. But
right, and the resource grabs implied by that, and the militarism or neo-imperialism implied by that should be obvious. I mean, think about resources like lithium and cobalt, and this like huge boom in development in the US needs to acquire those things, right? And I don't know. Then
they need to learn how to mine under Brooklyn. Those are your options. Like,
yeah. Yeah, they're talking about trying to mine lithium out of like Salton Sea, I guess. Yeah. So I'm sure that'll go well.
No problems there with our oceans at all. And I think one of the problems with being a hard problemist, maybe I'll call us that instead of ultra leftist. I don't consider myself an ultra leftist, but a lot of other people do. So who knows?
So, some of the folks at Heatwave wouldn't either. So but some of us would maybe. Ultra sounds cool, but obviously.
We're just interested in the complicated questions. That's just, we're interested in complicated questions and the harder answers.
Right. Well, I mean, I will say this: as much as I got frustrated with EndNotes Volume 4, so you're gonna know where I got frustrated at. I actually do think, for example, there are things even in that essay, A History of Separation, that I don't listen to communists have a good answer for. So, for example, if we agree with the Marxist-Leninists, which actually EndNotes people do, that the peasants were the driving revolutionary force for most of the middle 20th century for largely nationalist projects, what do you do now that there are no peasants? Not that there's no peasants, but there really is not a vast subsistence agricultural sector in anywhere in the world, and we now live in a place where there's more people in the urban world than the rural world everywhere, not just in the developed core. So
yeah, I mean, or even to be more abstract than say the peasantry specifically, but that there was an abrupt change. People knew there were different ways they could live because they had lived in different ways, and now they were industrialized, proletarianized. And I think that brings us back to imagination. Like, because of that experience, that generation or those generations had a sort of imagination. I think this also ties into like why a lot of indigenous struggles are kind of like some of the struggles at the forefront of what we see today is, again, like people who know there are other ways that we could live. But that doesn't help the fact that the vast majority of people are multi-generation, like urban proletariat. And I don't know if I can say the vast majority worldwide, but people who've lived basically in this way with things just like slowly getting worse, but have no direct or even generational experience of something else.
I think that I am fairly common for people who came out of the quote blue collar working class unquote, in the sense that my grandfather was a bricklayer, my mom was a waitress and then a nurse, and I am what do the social democrats call people like me? PMC something. Even though I draw a wage.
Downwardly mobile middle class.
Yeah, except I'm not. The funny thing is, I'm actually technically upwardly mobile, but still, I end up with those chuds. I love you all. You're my subscribers. Forgive me, but you know what I mean, though. Whereas, today we have a problem that like we haven't dealt with since the Second International. It's like even the proletariat, and there are some Maoists I think are very good on this actually. Are the former labor's like Ghana or in certain places like Latin America never even existed like at scale. Like if you're in like Colombia, you're now probably urbanized. You are probably working piecemeal jobs at site pay like day laborers, statistically speaking. And so most of the formal working class organizational styles that we've assumed since the Second International will not work for you. But you're not lumpen in any sense either. It's not like you're engaged in quote unquote criminal enterprises or black markets. You're doing day labor work in an informal economy, which even in the United States was common practice until the 1910s, 1920s, and frankly is becoming common practice again.
Yeah, so, I mean, I was going to say it's definitely becoming more. People are needing to supplement their full-time jobs with the gig, right? This is the sort of the gig economy to a certain extent. Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, we're just moving coins around right now, but maybe one day Heatwave will become some of our side gigs too. We can have the pleasure of that choice to have a lovely side gig that can bring in some petty cash into our lives. But this is the I think this is like this is really real. And the question that you bring up about like what do you do when there's no peasants, like the logical answer seems like, well, you have organized through the workers, right? That is the logical like historical answer, and from a Marxist standpoint that's just been ever present, right? Is that, well, you have to it is through labor that the organizations for this kind of activity takes place. But we also need to be honest that a lot of labor unions and labor organizations not only have sort of gone through the 20th century stagnation that I think most of us are probably familiar with, but and there's certainly they have maybe like a cultural moment over the past 10, 15 years of resurgence that feels a lot more cultural than it does in terms of like actual workers being unionized, particularly in the US. And so it's a tricky thing to kind of confront. And I think that some of maybe our past influences or the conversations around the ultra left have really tried to eschew this question of like unionized labor because it hasn't felt like a productive area in which things could move forward. And so I think it's worth considering this question of like what to do with labor unions or labor unionism, or whether there's something there or not, because it becomes particularly difficult to organize in the traditional format through labor conditions that are much more precarious and divided, where people are in workplaces where they maybe don't see their colleagues ever, or people's schedules change so much that you can't contact them. And so there's, I think the terrain of labor is both one that's been, a terrain of struggle ever since the origins of capitalism, but also one that's been shifting now that requires, I think, a re-understanding of what's useful in labor as a social relation to sort of dig into, as a way to get people to know each other and to, sort of increase some level of social or political activity in there. And I don't think there's any easy answers, but I think it's one that's, that's certainly worth discussing. And I think hopefully sort of an angle that we can bring to Heatwave, and also that we're seeing with other really good print outlets like Long Haul. Like I think they're doing a lot of that. And, whether it's like Notes from Below, Long Haul's doing this stuff, kind of trying to bring this question of labor activism from this other angle in a way that I think is exciting, but also not easy to resolve.
Yeah, I mean,
that's
I
a
think.
yeah.
Oh,
No, go
I
ahead.
think there was a in the question about the peasantry. There's also this
Mhm.
underlying question of like, what does social reproduction look like,
Mhm.
and how, and the peasantry was able to socially reproduce themselves without necessarily getting to capitalism. They could, but there was a way to sustain themselves. Not well. I'm gonna say it was a good life. I mean, this is coming. My family was basically Mexican peasants until now. So, um, but the like, but there was an outside. There was a way they could organize. There was these traditions of organizing outside of industrial labor, and I think that and I see that organize that type of organizing, that type of moving around the world within my own family, who are able to like keep these village ties together across borders, and
Mhm.
also in the way they're able to actually like get work for themselves through family connections. Like my father was the first one to move into the U.S., and he was able to get a job in construction, and then got jobs and was working the same crew of people with with the entire family basically after they moved here, and being able to keep that job working construction. It's shitty work. I mean, I fucking hate it, but it is work, and it's able to sustain themselves. And I mean, that also is not that type of labor, that type of day labor. That's also, I should say, is also common here in the U.S. You just don't see it that often unless you're like out in meatpacking industries, out in like dying towns which are being revitalized uh by immigrants.
My neighborhood.
uh yeah. Or or in like Amazon warehouses, where it's extremely multicultural, extremely global employment, which is also poses a challenge for the traditional forms of labor organizing, because oftentimes in these communities they're very tied to their ethnic or national background. Uh, but they do have an answer to the social reduction problem of like, how do we stay connected in this alienated world? I mean, I'm not going to say the values of that social reduction are necessarily good, but it is one way, and I think it's one way I think it's one thing that's been often overlooked in just like how to be able to organize in this kind of like post gig economy, this like, and in this like realization that the union, at least in the United States, in the traditional way, just doesn't work. I mean, probably doesn't even work in Mexico, but that's a different context that we're at right now. But
Yeah, I say this as a union guy and a rep, but I have also just come to the realizations that even if you look at the unions that have been successful in the last where most of the union growth are where the union activity is, right? Union growth has been in TAs, non-franchise service sector jobs like Starbucks, and it created the illusion of a lot of movement. But it was an illusion. But those shops are tiny. They're diffuse. They're hard. Like, I don't mean to be an asshole, but like, the world doesn't stop if Starbucks strikes. People just go to a different coffee house. Like, um,
I don't know. Americans love their treats.
Yeah.
fair enough. I mean,
I think I think you're making a fair point, and there's also like this type of organizing. I mean, if people are able to kind of like tap into the networks, into either the familial, village, or whatever networks of migrants that they've made for themselves, there is a way to like have slightly more impact. I mean, yeah, if nobody goes on the job for a couple of days, no one really in construction, like no one really bats an eye. But my family has stories of like people refusing to pay them or getting mistreated on a job, and they just like smash the shit. They communally smash the shit up, and then just kind of like demand payment, and they're able to get protected because they have community networks to be able to like find new jobs if the motherfucker doesn't want to pay up, or also just like you can go to another town because this one person, just like old union organization was like, this type of organization doesn't necessarily have to come from union, and it will come about because people have to have some sort of like protection, some sort of network. Of course, the recipes are being lost in this new generations, I would say, but I mean, the masses are creative or whatever. The masses learn in the act of doing and in the act of working.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Cameron.
No.
I was just to add on that. I think there are lots of ways to see. I think the more like formal unionism, and also I also say this as someone heavily involved in my own union, but that like there can be like political dead ends to this kind of work a lot of the time, in the sense of it, because the trap is always that you get so invested in labor conditions as such that it becomes nearly impossible to see beyond a world where those conditions would be different. And we're not just talking about improving XYZ thing, but a complete change in the social relations that create an employer and an employee under those types of in that type of power structure. So of course it becomes really difficult to do that. But what I will say is that I think one of our hopes with doing this magazine and trying to get out these different perspectives is that we can do it in a way that could also potentially relate to people that are getting sort of engaged politically through whatever sort of small waves of unionization or unionism that we see, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, because I think that these are often the places in which people build really important skills that they would need to do other political projects. But the problem is always that it also creates a certain politics that feels like it kind of runs into these limits really quickly. So it gives you all of these skills, but I think the downside is that it can give you a lack of political imagination. And so can we connect with people that have some of those skills of like, oh, if we needed to organize a demo, or if we need to get 10 people together to do something, like who could do it? How do you know how to do it? How do you contact people? How do you talk with people one-on-one? Like all of those basic skills can be really valuable in tons of other contexts outside of just doing union stuff. And I think to the degree to which there is institutional support to like train people, I think that that's not something that we should bat an eye at, but something that we want to sort of like take into consideration and be like, not only how do we get people to think through other uses of their locals or of their internationals when it comes to their unions, but also, can we talk to people and engage with people in a way that once they get frustrated with their union, and once they get frustrated with that next contract that like you fight so hard over and get next to nothing for, then maybe they start thinking about doing other things, and they'll have those skills. And theoretically, if like those are the kind of people that you're like, okay, what are some other things you could sort of orient your energy toward and use all those skills that you built up, doing this kind of work?
I think one of the things I'm thinking a lot about these days, and one of the things I think maybe you're talking about here that makes me really, I don't know, a mixture of hopeful and pessimistic simultaneously, is there are now a bunch of people talking about de-skilled proletariat, de-skilled labor, and are, I would sometimes say, are so specialized labor that they're effectively de-skilled. Like and also the amount of alienation in general society we see, because we are kind of having a crisis in social reproduction. And I'm not just talking about the birthing crisis. I actually do think that, like, I know there's a lot of pronatalists in my orbit, weirdly, but that's going to work itself out. But you're having a crisis of like getting people to care about a future at all, and that's bigger than just having kids. And I do think this is most severe in places like the United States and Europe, but I don't think it's just there. And as a left, I do think we have to confront this in a pretty nuanced way, and I'll bring up why. So you guys have been talking about like peasant structures and peasant social reproduction, and you know, I agree with you. One of the things I learned, like hanging out in rural Mexico, particularly in the South, doing the whole white guy tourist thing, is
You said it, not me,
yeah.
but I agree.
Yeah. I had no. I was integrated into the Norse community. I was just an observer in the South. I won't go into the ironies of how much of the Zapatistas' income was from tourists, but nonetheless, doing that thing. I was actually keenly aware. I became aware, particularly in Mexico, that under modern conditions, a lot of what Marx talked about in the 19th century has been reversed. So when I saw him, and was invited in to kind of participate in Southern Mexican village life, I would not want to live there. But I promise you, if I was to choose between being dirt poor there or dirt poor in a post-industrial ranchero in the north, give me the village life, like without a question. And that's the opposite of what 19th and early 20th century socialists assumed, right? We have to ask ourselves a question, though, because the peasant way of life is not particularly viable and doesn't exist at scale anymore, as we've been talking about. What does that say for socialization of the proletariat? And one of the things is, like, as frustrated as I can sometimes get with communization theory and their riot solve everything tendency that they're finally moving out of. I do think they have a point about what Matt Christman also has called the Pringles in the can problem of the post-industrial proletariat, which is like the post-industrial proletariat. Well, he says, Matt Christman says, and for all of his social democratic tendencies, this is actually key insight. When Marx complained about the French peasantry being potatoes in a sack, he was not really seeing the fact that today the post-industrial service-based proletariat is basically Pringles in a can.
Okay.
It's like mass-produced and processed, but still pretty alone. And so I think that is a real problem, and it's something we have to somehow come up with ways to deal with. The union form was a way to deal with it. I'm not totally willing to abandon the union form because it was like an actual working class institution, kind of, that still kind of sort of exists. But we have to go beyond that because it's just not. It isn't sufficient for the moment, no matter what we want to believe. And even if you think about, like, if you read the work of Kim Moody or Joe Burns or any of those people, and you start thinking about the implications of why they focus so much on logistics, the fact that they have to focus on logistics means that something has fundamentally changed in the organic composition of industrial production, that you just don't need that many people. So it's hard to imagine a mass strike without finding enough scabs to fill it in. Whereas you still, for now at least, need tons of people in logistics. That's why trucking is one of the largest industries in the United States. But in and of itself, there's a lot of like not admitting that that's a problem for socialist strategy and for unions as a strategy, because one of the problems that you have with logistics unions is, historically speaking, they're the most reactionary unions. For a variety of material input reasons, right? Like a trucker works alone. Their incentives are totally different. Like,
or they own their truck, or they lease their truck.
They own or lease their truck, right? Like, they're, even when they're wage laborers, they're like semi petit bourgeois. The other areas of logistics have not been allowed to unionize in the same way. That came back to a head during the Biden administration. And there's, obvious reasons for that. as they said in the 30s, national security. So to me, this indicates that there is a failed ability to think beyond that. But, having seen riots and participated in them, I just don't have Jasper Burns's or the late Josh Klober's faith that forces people into a long-term sustainable community. So, I guess this is the hardest problem. But what do you guys look at as a way to answer this organizational problem that is primary? Because you know what everyone says? They say the party, but then you go, okay, but how do you get there? And
yeah, yeah. I guess I'll say in defense of communization to a degree that like we could look at it less as like the riot is the easy answer and more as where do we see proletarians going on the offensive and not just fighting more like defensive struggles through a union that's got a no strike clause. And we see that when people take to the streets in various ways. And we also see where that tends to go. And we have to be real about that too. I guess, like you're saying that where the terrain is viable for rank and file union militancy, go for it. But the terrain is increasingly not viable for that. And I don't know. I don't want to just be like, because again, it's an easy answer to say like, well, crises will, as they multiply, subsistence struggles will have to eventually develop a horizon that looks beyond capitalism or just die. I mean, and that could just be it, right? But I guess I don't see a place where like we, the like well-read left, can just sort of assert like, here's what to do and put forward like an organizational form that's ready-made for what lies ahead. It's not maybe a good answer, but it's a very extremely difficult question. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and maybe in defense of Jasper and Joshua a little bit, like I think it's really like the riot for them was really like an essential component of what class struggle or revolution would look like, and not the end all be all. Like it's not like the riot that never ends and then everything is like somehow just like burned to the ground and then like there's some sort of like clean slate start over. But that, and I think that this is something that Phil Neal actually talks a little bit about in the Theory of the Party. I think one of his recent pieces, where like class struggle is probably going, it like sort of has to be confrontational to a certain extent, and those confrontations often will take this form. And I think that's one of the sort of a simplified version of Joshua's riot strike riot is that like there's a reason in this period today that those confrontations look like riots more than they look like strikes, and that they looked like strikes in a previous era because of certain compositions of the working class, and of course the reflection of that is capital composition. And so I think like the degree to which class conflict looks more and more like a riot today, the question is not so much like the riot is the only true expression, but that we'll likely see lots of various like class struggle look like that. And then the question is, how do you engage with that? Participation is certainly one of the many things that can, though, of like a way to engage with it. But I think the question that you're asking, which is the $1 million one, is like, well, what happens next, right? And I think if I'm not like the most well read in the communization theory world, but I think that line was always like, well, you kind of make it grow, or like communism is the immediate reproduction of life as communism without these sort of transitionary steps. And I think sometimes that vision makes it just seem so simple and so easy, like it feels like this clean answer, but I think actually trying to do that is really complex. And I think that one of the things that, at least just personally, that I've reflected on a lot is more like what kinds of institutions can be created so that when like class antagonism and things like riots or otherwise take place, that people can relate to them and understand them beyond just the few days where like the riot actually is successful, in the sense that the group of people that can engage in that activity can hold the police off in order to do enough damage to basically like have it be a riot. Because it doesn't, that portion can only last for so long. And even in countries where we've seen the sort of like the riot form depose the government, you're also then still in this, we haven't seen them depose the government and the military. Like, so then there's the military, and you have to figure out how to navigate that. And so, I think like the only thing that I can think of, and this is, part of why I'm invested in this magazine, is because it feels like there needs to be some way to get people to not only have a different like sort of theoretical relationship to what class conflict looks like, and how to not look at it as this bad scary thing, but something that's actually like pushing like the history of humans forward to a certain extent, but also how to have institutions that can support that kind of activity and support the efforts and energy that goes into those things, without just assuming that like that type of antagonism in the form of a riot is going to continue forever. And so it can't just be raising awareness. It can't just be this like consciousness raising activity, but it has to be something that has an institutional support behind it as well, because it needs that social reproductive component. And I think for some people that's the commune form or something else. And, that like sort of, that makes sense to me too. But I think that the sort of like the minimal, the sort of like the whatever kind of like humble contribution that I feel like I could, personally add, would just be somehow blending the material and institutional with some kind of like knowledge or reframing of what's taking place.
Yeah, a lot of my friends come from like a more like anarchist political background, and I guess one of the things, like, so they're kind of an audience I have in mind, or people who I'm in dialogue with when I think about writing. And so I guess to bring up another communization group, I mean, the TC concept of the glass floor is like pointing out like a huge limit that we see with riots, is their inability to extend themselves into the realms of production and reproduction, and to begin, reproducing society in a different way. And I'm not talking about like 2020 I don't think that movement had the force to do something like that, but you could look at Egypt. I mean, I think you were there, Varn, during the big one. Is that right? Like over 100 police stations burned, people kind of taking the city, and we talk about not breaking the arm power of the state. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's movements that we've seen where the potential was there to begin a radical reorientation of production and social reproduction. But I don't think the will is there. I think a big problem with ultra leftists is a tendency to project our politics onto participants in street movements. I guess it's not just that people why don't they start communizing things? They don't want to. I mean, that idea is just like alien to people, I think. So, yeah, sorry, I kind of rambled there.
No, it's fine.
I mean, I kind of wanted to talk about first, our answer to the problem of organization is the magazine form, which you can fill out on our Patreon. No. But to talk about earlier about like the descaling of contemporary labor, like, I mean, I think that's a real issue, especially, I don't know, seeing people that don't know that fruit grows on trees, that, you can just pick out, like people don't know where food comes from, which to me is like a very like, just unbelievable thing to like not know, but this is the reality we live in. Which I think, this is why people kind of have these cottagecore fantasies, because people kind of like think about these different ways of living where they can feel more, they're more active in the construction of their daily life.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, cottagecore shit, I mean, it has its own bucket of problems, one, as you know, I'm not really fond of farm work in general. Much as I love riding horses, I'm not, I don't like farm work. And I like the amenities of modern society, like the internet. I like my anime.
Well, I mean,
but
the other thing about the cottagecore is half of this like stuff you encounter on TikTok or YouTube anyway, which means they have, even if they're farmsteading,
yeah,
that they somehow have modern internet.
Well, exactly. Not to mention just the gender dynamics that underlying all of that, which is his own issue that we in social reproduction that we also should have to deal with. I mean, not in the social justice guilty way, but like a real. We should always be critical of our own behavior, especially as it pertains to organizing. Which I mean, we all have our faults, and we all have to try better to be, just better social creatures. Um, but in that, I mean, we do have to we do have to try to kind of like, I don't know, these type of organizations which kind of like bring a better dignity to daily life, like these these skills that we learn to speak better, to talk to people better, to to just live a life, to be like more intellectual, like that, like work some organizations in the past have done, reading during the job, like have someone read pages out of like fucking Capital during the job. And I mean, as much, I'm a total pessimist, but as much as we want to give a positive vision of what to do or what to organize, part of that is by just trying to show, by doing a better life, a better life, a better way of doing things, like to show that like there is like the future doesn't have to be tied to what is happening right now, to what is to the now, I guess. That and yeah, and we kind of, and a start to that could be the riot, which is like the riot as the start of something better, as the first act of destruction of this life, of this world, and as the first creative act in building whatever we actually want to create. Which I'm pretty hesitant myself to just have a positive vision, just because coming from like a state in the deep south, people already have a hard time just wanting to like destroy a cop car for some reason, or just have to even say the desire that cops suck. Even in racialized populations, which I mostly live. I don't really, unfortunately, I have to interact with white people, but luckily, I live a life where I do live around people of color. But there is like this reactionary. I mean, Sophie Lewis wrote an interesting piece about trad life influencers or whatever, and the example that she chose was like a person of color, like couple from like living in the UK or some shit. But it was interesting that like, oh, these like were people of color that want to live this white life. And that's kind of like the reality in many parts of like a very diverse South that that people often forget. In the diversity of the South, there's also a diversity in reactionary tendencies. They latch on to the reactionary sides of our like homeland cultures or the diasporic cultures, or they like latch on to an assimilationist campaign. And these are like kind of like the currents that we're kind of like fighting against, or trying to fight against, and have to kind of like try to provide an alternative. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying Heatwave will provide this alternative view, but at the very least we'll have like some sort of like intellectual kind of like base to try to think of and promote like alternative. I mean, that's kind of like for the people who pick up the magazine, and when they're able to connect with other readers or other people in their own daily lives, maybe that's like a project you can do. I mean, or something that you can do after you read the magazine and maybe you're inspired by these ideas and want to do something. You don't necessarily have to join some existing organization. It'd be cool, I guess, depending on how cool your organizations are. But these things don't necessarily have to have like come from what's already existing. we are, we are communists, we are collectivists or whatever, but there's still a lot to be said for the individual and our own capacities as an individual to extend our collective power.
I think. Go ahead.
I'll just throw in that I haven't read any of the drafts yet. I think though that for Heatwave number 3, there's going to be several articles. Maybe kind of the focus of the issue will be on talking about organization and what that means today. Yeah, and I'd also like Chris had mentioned, I plug Phil's Theory of the Party essay that was just published. I think half of it will be on ill will, and maybe a follow-up will be in Heatwave or something like that. But yeah, so some thought-provoking stuff.
Yeah, I think to be sympathetic to Jasper and Phil. I've had Phil on the show. I've never interacted with Jasper, and well, that's actually not true. Jasper and I have insulted each other on Facebook. But but
nice.
but I actually do like a lot of Jasper's writings. I will say that I feel like for all that I came down on Riot Strike Riot when it was produced, I agree that the primary confrontation with both capital and the state right now is the riot, because most other forms are closed off. And I have been trying to think about what we do about that, except for hoping that some Hail Mary pass creates a party somehow, whether it's the SEC form after its 15 millionth time finally becomes successful, or somehow we have a sleeper cell in the Democratic Party which blew it up and had it abolish the Senate and the Supreme Court and the presidency overnight, and we are ruled by a unicameral legislature of which there are 3 parties, 2 of which are left parties which broke from the Democratic Party. Long
we're doing the Carl Schmitt route.
Is that the mug dream?
I don't know the mug
new constitution.
They want a new constitution. I mean, the mug dream seems to be we don't split from the Democratic Party, that we just preemptively leave it and then we fight for a constitution. And on the Constitution is a limitation to socialist practice. It's even a limitation at this point to liberal praxis. I agree with them. I don't know how you do that.
Well, and I mean, I feel like we're almost past the point where that matters, when the Supreme Court is partisan to such a degree that the Constitution is sort of, it's just something that's there.
I was about to say, like, the last month has indicated to me that everybody who said they were defending the Constitution doesn't know what's in it, or is just lying, and the Constitution is not really in play anymore.
See, but they make sure to have a copy of their Constitution on their, next to their heart, in that pocket or whatever.
Oh yeah,
or on their ass.
Yeah, in case I don't know, they get shot and it's got Kevlar in it or something. I don't know. It's interesting where we're at, because I the one thing I can say about the United States right now is that every side of U.S. society believes it's in crisis. Like, seriously, including the dominant winning one. That's how they're justifying what they're doing. And yet, I would also say the dominant political imagination is nothing ever changes. It's not even like, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. It's something, even more fatalistic than that. And I include leftists in that. Now, Bruno, I am also a super pessimist, as you probably know if you've listened to the show. But I have been really thinking about what that means, because it seems to me that stuff is actually happening, and I'm hearing people say nothing ever happens. Of all stripes. It's, like ultra leftist, Marxist, Leninist, liberals, conservatives, super reactionaries who beat off to pictures of the Habsburgs. Like, they're all kind of saying the same thing. So,
I mean, stuff always happens. The thing is, I always have to go to work the next day.
that's true.
That to me, this is how I solve the Hegelian contradiction. This is how I do dialectics. This is how I solve the problem of like nothing ever happens, but
Right,
stuff is always happening.
Like I've gone to work on days where the wildfire smoke was so bad that you just look around at the coworkers and be like, "Are we really just still doing this?" Because I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and meanwhile, my family chat, people in the Southeast talking about like they're tallying how many houses are falling into the ocean right now in North Carolina, and yet, like Bruno said, back to work. So
the expensive suburbs are literally falling off mountainsides here. Seriously. Go ahead, Jesus. Bruno.
Yeah, and we're building the replacements out here where I'm from. So,
okay.
But I mean, this is kind of like the attitude that I just grew up in from my parents. My parents were not political. I'm like a first generation leftist or whatever you want to call it, ultra leftist or whatever.
I'm first generation leftist at all, so I feel you.
First generation anarchist. But but it is like the primary mode of operandi in terms of political like upbringing that my parents, it's like we grew up as peasants, and whatever happened up there in the palace of power, we always got the short end of the stick, and our lives just got we just have to keep working, you have to keep going to the fields, you have to keep looking for work, whatever. And this is like in the mountains of Chihuahua and the mountains of Coahuila. And generally it kind of like it breeds a cynicism, but it also breeds a own like at least in the case of my family, it breeds like a self-reliance that I think has been very important in the way that I go around things and I like interact with people, and a perspective that just seems to like not gel as well as other people, but at least a certain respect, I guess, because you know how to do shit at the very least. At least I can ride a horse and also build a house, which is more than a lot of people can say. And I can read in multiple languages. And I'm also constantly trying to learn. Like I'm hedging my bets with the rise of China because I'm learning Mandarin right now. But I mean, I think, I think this, I guess this is to say that I am sympathetic, and I think there is kind of like a sense of logic to this nothing ever happens mentality. It's just then we have, the question is, okay, nothing ever happens. Now what? We want stuff to happen. How do we make stuff happen? Even if we still have to go to work the next day. I guess the question is, how do we make it so we don't have to work the next day? So you can do something else. Or to do something else that we want to do. Because there are definitely other things we can do and not go to work next day, but it's still going to suck.
I was going to say, you could be conscripted. That's generally not going to work next day. But I mean, I will also say, like, to back up your point, when I was both in Mexico and in Egypt, you'd be surprised how much of like quotidian life, including going to work the next day, continued when the government completely failed. Like, it wasn't just like weird government changes. It's like no, literally there's no water in the pipes today, and yet things kind of go on. And I guess my thing is sometimes that isn't always true. And I think I also think maybe there's a difference between the what you're describing as nothing ever happens for people who've like lived in rough significance, you just get up and go to work the next day, and then people who say nothing ever happens and they're students.
True.
A certain poverty to student life, some might say.
Where I'm just like, I kind of get it if the life goes on, because as I've told people, even in like dire civil wars where like 5 to 10% of the population's dying, for 70% of that population, life is still going on. Like until it's not. I mean, you know, basically until it's right at your doorstep. And I think we've been hurt by imaginaries that are either quotidian or apocalyptic. So I mean, you know, you would think the apocalyptic would breed political imagination, and one time I thought it did, but I've now decided it kind of doesn't.
I mean, wasn't the rapture supposed to happen last week or something?
Yeah, last week again. As a southerner, I'm from the southeast United States myself. I grew up in Georgia. Do you know how many rapture predictions I've lived through? At least 15.
Probably the same. Well, yeah.
At least 15. Yeah. It was an entire industry when I was a kid. So like,
yeah, I want to be the guy who repaints or re-decals the rapture van, like the one with the billboard on the side, to get it ready for the next one. That's a cool job.
I mean, isn't that just the poster that that Heatwave has? That's like, I want to believe, but it's in the tendency for a rate of profit to fall. It's like, oh, the crash will happen sometime. Yeah. That's our millenarianism.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, this is like kind of apocalyptic, but in terms of nothing ever changes versus things change. I mean, we have, I guess, lived through the end of the Holocene epoch and are now entering something new. And there's an argument in anthropology that it wasn't agriculture per se, but it was the stable climate of the Holocene, which made persistent inequality, class society possible in the first place. So I guess it's an interesting question to ponder, is that if we're moving out of the kind of climactic stability that made civilization or class society even possible, what does that mean? And what ideas and forms are adequate to, I mean, it's almost like beyond thinking.
Well,
and yet
I have
is
a
happening.
backup of warlordism if all else fails. So, like,
I hope it's an end to the indigenous apocalypse that we live through right now. So
for sure, yeah,
that would be great. In my warlord band, all are welcome, particularly indigenous people who know how to deal with natural food waste. So
don't typecast indigenous people like that.
Man, white people and magical thinking about brown people is actually one of the weirdest phenomenons I think I've ever seen. But anyway, that's not relevant to today. But
oh, really now,
it is something that I constantly think about when I talk about, like, when I do my anthropology shows. I'm like, who's gonna take this away and go like, oh, so the 2% of the population that's left is going to magically save the entire planet? Because I do meet people who will. I mean, I argued with a leftist from the American expat in the Netherlands about, like, he's like, well, if we spoke indigenous languages, there would be no wars. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, like if that was the only change.
Well, the idea is that the structural changes of the language would force changes about the conceptual times that would force other changes. But I'm just like, I'm just like, A, that's cipher wharfism on some deep crack, and B,
DMT.
And B, like, do you not think indigenous people had wars or had like our class societies? I mean, a lot of, like, I mean, never mind. I mean, it was just like, what kind of weird flattening out of the past have you done? But
it's another easy answer to imagine, and that's what's captivating, I guess.
Well, it's an easy answer, and I think it comes from a place of like partial realization of guilt, because European capitalism and the fact that space is white has, although that might change, you do have to deal with that somehow, if it's
I mean,
that or
yeah.
the angel of history is going to make everything okay or whatever. Like,
I mean, there are people that embrace the colonialism in America,
well, that
especially
too.
right now.
I mean, that is a way to deal with the cognitive dissonance, is just to go back and say it was good. I mean, you know, it's like, okay, well, we should do more of that even.
Well, the other thing about that language, if we all everyone just started speaking a different language. I mean, first of all, it's not very easy to learn a lot of languages. But second, like any kind of political imaginary that just starts with, if we all just suddenly started doing things totally different, is not rooted in, you know, we have to have politics that are rooted in the struggles and lived experience of people today, and that flow from that. And you know, it's like, and also the sort of tendencies of capital that dominate us. I was just listening to an interview on some other podcast. I don't want to name it or whatever, but it was an eco-socialist basically saying like, oh, we all basically are going to do co-ops. I mean, and this was an idea from like the 70s. We're going to have these federations of co-ops, and they're slowly going to spread and expand, and it's going to build a world alternative to capital. And I'm just like, I don't know, come on, like
in capital,
Pure idealism.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
And you know, it has been tried. It was called national syndicalism, and I can tell you where it ended up. You know, they were part of the fascist coalition. So, which is not to say that any of this inevitably leads to anything. I actually don't believe in that ideological genealogy critique either. But it is fascinating to me. I guess you're right that a lot of what the left has to deal with today is the fact that we really want easy answers that are immediately sellable. Also, because there's this weird belief that somehow popularity dictates the future, which is a very strange understanding of how politics works, because I literally don't think that's ever been true.
It's a very democratic understanding of history.
Right.
Right.
And democratic in the stupidest sense. Like,
I thought about this when I read Vincent Bevan's book, because he was basically saying that like a more Leninist party would have been the answer to like the struggles of the past decades. And to me, the more interesting question, even if that was true, is in all of these countries all around the world, those parties do exist and they're extremely unpopular. And so why is that? I mean, and his answer is just Hollywood ideology, which is, I don't think an adequate answer to that question.
mean, I read that book and I was actually vastly disappointed by it, because he makes a lot of good critiques of like left-wing journalism and like horizontalism and this and the other. But then his answer is, and I also say he doesn't actually even come out and say, I would want a Marxist-Leninist party to run this. But I just have to, say, like, one, those parties exist. Two, why did you think anyone turned to horizontalism in the first place? Like,
right.
Like, why did that become it's Hollywood ideology? It's the ideology of elite. At one time, Marxist-Leninism was an ideology of elites in liberal circles. It was. During the Popular Front period. And it remained so in the developing world. I mean, in some places even now. And yet, it also didn't produce what he wanted it to produce. And I'm just like, are you just mad at the hippies you had to deal with in college? Because this feels like, and then you saw screw up things in Brazil.
I mean, look, I do find hippies annoying, so I can agree with him on that one. Can't blame him on that one.
I mean, there's a lot of left discourse that seems populist. That if you break it down, it's like, oh no, you're mad at the people that you work with who are more like you. You don't know much. I mean, like Bevins at least did the footwork as a journalist to talk about some of these areas. I'll give him the credit for that. But like, one of the reasons why I just don't care about the PMC versus anti-PMC debates is I'm like, this is all led by professors who are just mad about which elite is dominating everything. And you just had a stark reminder that the center actually does not run the world. And
I mean, I think this is like with Heatwave. It's like we're not trying to kind of like sell the masses as an answer. We're trying to kind of like find the like nuances within the masses or within the people, within our world, to kind of like find where like the fault lines are, to find where like our moments of rupture can be done, or where moments of ruptures have happened, and what can we learn from that. There's a lot to be learned from where people gather and where lots of people do the same thing, but that doesn't mean that that's an answer, or like just because a lot of people are doing something doesn't mean that's like the direction we should take. We should always be self-reflective about this. Some may call it, self-critical, self-critique, but we're also not Maoists, so we're not going to call it that.
yeah. I don't know. Maybe you should culturally appropriate autocritique. No,
it's called recuperation.
Recuperation
the situation it says.
Recuperation of autocritique. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think people should check out your work. I'm going to be covering more of your articles. I have actually like 3 or 4 in my hopper to cover on radical engagements, but I also have like hundreds of articles to cover. But I do plan on doing more of them. Because I do think we need some interventions right now. I think the left is in a particularly bad rut at the moment, whatever it is, whatever the left is. And I do sort of feel like we sort of wasted a decade. So, but maybe we haven't. It's always hard to call that. You always feel that way when you're going through it. And then, you look back 10 years and maybe like seeds that have been sown as early as last year and as far back as the 70s finally come to fruition. It's hard to say, honestly. But it does seem like, I don't know. I wonder what it's going to mean now that people have been disillusioned with Bernieism and now Corbynism, because your party has gone kind of belly up very quickly.
Almost bizarre how they instantly botched that. I don't understand, but
yeah, I was like, man, that's not even competent for that. Like, that like you make George Galloway seem competent. That's impressive. But yeah, I don't know. And so maybe this is a moment for reflection. But a lot of what I have seen come out of this time period, which I think deals with what you're addressing, but in the worst way, is weird hybrid ideologies. I mean, the most obvious one and weirdest one is like MAGA communism, but there's tons of them. I mean, like, how many weird forms of anarchism have come out of college dorms lately?
I mean, way back too. I remember in 2016, 2013, 2012.
Yeah.
I mean, this is also, I think, just an effect of the social isolation in general, that an alienation that we're experiencing, where the internet is like the main form of communication and information gathering. So this kind of like schizophrenia in the fucking Deleuzian, or the Deleuzian-Guattari sense is like the dominant form of like idea making, instead of like an active engagement with the like social world in a physical sense, in a physical presence, where people actually have to like, where people actually get the shit beat out of them for saying the wrong shit.
Yeah, I think that's good to bring it back to and point out the conditions that kind of produce this, and social media, especially, where you're incentivized to say extreme or odd things, and to identify yourself through like an increasingly niche set of genres, basically, that we call political tendencies. But yeah. So
yeah, thank you for having us on.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Where can people find your work?
We are on, I think, pretty much all the social media platforms. And then our website, let me make sure I don't say it wrong, is heatwavemag.info. I also would like to encourage people to consider submitting or dialoguing with us, and even if, and maybe even especially if you don't consider yourself like ultra left or whatever, we're interested in conversation and dialogue and I guess pieces that like submissions that don't necessarily adhere to like any standard line. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can subscribe on our Patreon for physical copies of magazines once they release. We're aiming for a quarterly schedule in terms of release date, but I don't think that'll change. But the schedule is just we're like having printer scheduling stuff. And if you want a physical issue of the first issue of the magazine, you can go to shop.haters.life for a copy of the first issue. They are running low, so if you're thinking about buying one, do it sooner rather than later, because we're kind of running out of the physical issues. And if you subscribe to the Patreon, you also get access to the Discord server. So if you want to, for whatever reason, talk to other Heatwavers who are also too online, that's another perk you get for subscribing.
Right, and I think AP Andy from Antifada and another comrade want to start an online reading group for Heatwave related stuff on our Discord. So if you get on there, you can participate in that whenever that gets going.
You too can be part of yet another reading group. This is the main form I socialize outside of work. So.
Yeah.
Chris, do you want to add anything?
No, I think we covered it. We got the Patreon, we got the Discord, we got the website, the physical magazine. Thanks for having us on, Varn. It's been great chatting, and I'm a fan of the work that you're putting out. I really like the intro to this podcast too, just like combining everything through the matrix eye. So I like the like universal synthetic approach you've got going.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of people missed my old intro, which would likely get me removed from YouTube and hassled by ICE now. But
sometimes it's got to be out there. Come on, defend free speech.
It is really easy to get removed from YouTube these days. I was on Cosmonaut magazine and they had someone dancing with a Kalashnikov from a classic Russian play from the Soviet era, and that got them banned for promotion of violence.
Damn, I didn't know it was that bad now.
It's that bad now.
See here, I grew up with like videos of cartel killings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also they didn't do shit about Charlie Kirk getting blown up on every social media platform. But anyway,
right.
On that note, thank you. Go ahead. Say what you're gonna say.
I just want to say thanks, echoing everyone else. Thanks for having us. And I've listened to your show a lot. I'm actually like a subscriber, and so it's almost bizarre to actually be on the show now. But yeah,
it happens. You never know with me. I'll interview anybody I find interesting because
cool.
I kind of don't care about. I just don't care about all this matrix you're supposed to care about in this. I'm like, smart people will find it, and if they don't, then I obviously screwed up. Like, that's just my attitude. All right, thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, and listeners, I'll put the information about the magazine in the show notes. Bye-bye.